There is footage of Karen Carpenter playing drums that most people have never seen, and when they do see it, can't quite reconcile with everything they think they know about her. She is maybe 19. She is behind a full kit, and she is not accompanying anything. She is driving it. Her face has that specific blankness that drummers get when they're locked in, the expression that isn't absence, but total presence, the look of someone who has gone somewhere the camera can't follow. She is not delicate. She is not wistful. She is hitting things with a great deal of conviction, and she looks, more than anything else, like someone who is exactly where she wants to be. This is the version of Karen Carpenter the story usually skips. The voice is what people remember. The voice is what gets played at funerals and in grocery stores and in that specific kind of late-night documentary where everyone speaks in hushed tones about what was lost. And the voice was real, genuinely, almost unfairly beautiful, the kind of instrument that made producers go quiet in the booth the first time they heard it. That part of the story is true, but she was a drummer first. She chose that. Nobody handed it to her. What happened between that girl behind the kit and the woman who died alone on a closet floor in Downey, California, on a February morning in 1983? That's a longer story. It involves a brother, a mother, an industry, a husband, a disease that didn't have much cultural language yet, and a particular kind of love that looks, from certain angles, almost indistinguishable from control. It starts, as most things do, earlier than you'd think. Downey, California, in the early 1960s, was the kind of place that existed to be left. Not in a cruel way, just in the way of certain American suburbs that seemed designed as staging areas, places where families landed before becoming whatever they were actually going to become. The Carpenters arrived there in 1963, having relocated from New Haven, Connecticut, largely because Richard, 16, already consumed by music, had heard that the Los Angeles area had better opportunities for a young pianist who was serious about what he was doing. Agnes and Harold Carpenter made the move. That's worth noting. The family relocated for Richard's ambitions. This is not a small thing. Karen was 13. She hadn't found her instrument yet, which in the Carpenter household apparently constituted a mild problem. Richard had been composing since he was a child. Agnes had opinions about musical achievement that she expressed often and with specificity. Karen, by most accounts, was still figuring out what she was. What she found at Downey High School was the school band, and what she found in the school band, almost by accident, because the percussion section needed a body, was drums. She was not supposed to be good at it. There's no particular reason a 13-year-old girl from a family oriented around piano and vocal performance should have sat down behind a trap set and immediately understood it. But she did. Her band director, a man named Wallace Fredrickson, reportedly recognized within weeks that she had genuine talent. Not beginner talent, not encouraging talent, but the real kind that you don't manufacture through instruction. She had natural rhythm, and she had power, and she had, apparently, an intuitive grasp of how a kit worked as a single instrument rather than a collection of separate pieces. She practiced obsessively. This is a word that will recur in Karen's story in contexts that become progressively less benign, but here, at 13 and 14, it just meant dedication. She joined a local band with Richard called the Richard Carpenter Trio, which required her to play jazz standards for adult audiences at small venues. A strange adolescence, but one she seemed to genuinely enjoy. She was, by all available accounts, happy behind the kit. Loose in a way she wasn't always loose elsewhere. There's a detail from this period that doesn't get much attention. When Karen was around 15, she started carrying drumsticks with her essentially everywhere. In her school bag, to dinner, on family outings, she would tap out rhythms on surfaces, tables, her own knees, the dashboard of the car, in the absent-minded way that people do when their brain is always slightly somewhere else. Agnes apparently found this irritating. Harold thought it was funny. Richard, characteristically, was probably thinking about chord progressions and not paying attention. The Richard Carpenter Trio eventually became a quartet, then evolved into a group called Spectrum, which is where things started to shift in ways Karen likely didn't see coming. The group was auditioning for a recording contract. They were playing originals. They were, in Richard's vision, going to be a proper band. Harmonies, arrangements, the works. Karen sang in this configuration, which she'd been doing alongside playing since the trio days. She had a good voice. Everyone acknowledged she had a good voice. What happened next has been told many times, usually as a story about discovery. Herb Alpert at A&M Records heard a demo. He heard Karen's voice. He signed them. The drummer became the singer. This is generally presented as the obvious move, the inevitable one, the moment where Karen's real talent was recognized. And maybe it was. The voice was extraordinary. A rich, warm contralto that sat in a register that felt like it was coming from somewhere deeper than a person that small should have been able to reach. When she sang Close to You in 1970, something happened in the air. That's not a metaphor. You can hear it in the recording. But the drummer question is worth sitting with for a moment. Karen didn't stop playing drums. She played on many of the Carpenters' recordings, and she continued to perform behind the kit during live shows for years. A visual fact that caused some consternation among industry people, because the consensus was that a female vocalist should be out front, should be visible, should not be half obscured by hardware while playing what was coded as a masculine instrument. There were conversations, there were suggestions. Karen pushed back on them for a while. What she said in various interviews throughout the early 70s was that she felt more comfortable behind the drums, more herself. The phrase she used more than once was that she could hide back there, and she usually said it with a laugh, the way you say something true while giving yourself plausible deniability about having said it. She felt more comfortable when she couldn't be fully seen. By 1974 or so, she was out front permanently. The drums were still there on recordings, but the image, the one being sold, the one that went on magazine covers and television specials and into the homes of millions of people who bought the records, was Karen Carpenter, the vocalist. Soft-spoken, sweet, standing at a microphone in an evening gown. The transition happened gradually enough that there was no single moment of loss to point to. That's often how it works. You don't notice the thing being taken because it's taken slowly and because the thing replacing it is genuinely good, and because the people doing the taking are not villains. They're just people who have a clear idea of what sells and a limited interest in what doesn't. Richard loved his sister. Agnes loved her children. Herb Alpert was running a record label, not a therapy practice. Nobody meant for Karen to feel like she was disappearing. It happened anyway. In 1970, Close to You spent 4 weeks at #1. The follow-up, We've Only Just Begun, did the same. The Carpenters were, almost overnight, one of the best-selling acts in the country, which created an immediate problem because the country wasn't entirely sure how to feel about that. The critical response to the Carpenters in their peak years is its own small cultural document. The music press did not like them. This is putting it gently. Rolling Stone treated them with the specific contempt reserved for things that are enormously popular without being cool. And the general consensus among the tastemakers of early 70s rock culture was that the Carpenters represented something soft, something suburban, something that people who didn't really understand music would buy. The word saccharine appeared in so many reviews, it started to feel less like a descriptor and more like a reflex. What's interesting about this, in retrospect, is how much of it was a class judgment dressed up as an aesthetic one. The Carpenters came from Downey. They were clean. They didn't do drugs, at least not publicly. They wore nice clothes and smiled and made music that your parents could listen to without leaving the room. In the context of 1971, this was apparently unforgivable. The audience disagreed, massively and consistently. The records sold in numbers that A&M, which was not a small operation, found difficult to process. Rainy Days and Mondays, Superstar, Goodbye to Love, Yesterday Once More. Somewhere between 15 and 20 top 10 singles across the decade, depending on how you count. Globally, not just domestically, the Carpenters were enormous in Japan, in the UK, across Europe, in markets where the specific American cultural politics around cool didn't apply, and people just heard what the music actually was, which was extraordinarily well made. Richard deserves credit here that he doesn't always receive in Karen's story. He was a genuinely gifted arranger. The productions he built around her voice were not simple. They were dense, carefully constructed things that used Karen's vocal range with a precision that bordered on architectural. He understood that her contralto needed space, that it couldn't be crowded, that the right frame for it was lush, but not busy. The famous vocal overdubbing technique he developed, stacking Karen's voice in multiple layers, became one of the most recognizable sounds of the decade. He built the machine carefully. Karen was the machine. There's a way in which this arrangement worked perfectly and a way in which it didn't work at all, and both of those things were true simultaneously for most of the 1970s. What worked? Karen's voice through Richard's arrangements produced something genuinely rare. The records hold up in a way that a lot of their contemporaries don't, not as nostalgia objects, but as actual music. Superstar, originally a Joe Cocker song, later a Leon Russell and Bonnie Bramlett composition, becomes something different when Karen sings it. The longing in it acquires a particular weight. She wasn't just technically accomplished. She had interpretive intelligence, an instinct for where the emotional center of a lyric was and how to approach it without overselling. Producers who worked with her consistently described a quality that was difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss. A kind of naked sincerity in her delivery that couldn't be manufactured. What didn't work? Karen had almost no creative control. The song selection was Richard's domain. The arrangements were Richard's domain. The image, what she wore, how she was photographed, what the albums looked like, was managed by A&M with Richard's input. Karen's own musical instincts, which ran in somewhat different directions than the material she was being given, were accommodated occasionally and overruled consistently. She wanted to do a disco record at one point. This was treated as an amusing sidebar. She also wanted to be taken seriously as a drummer, which the industry had more or less finished with by the mid-70s. She played on records. She didn't play in the image. In 1972, the Carpenters performed at the White House for Richard Nixon. This is one of those facts that functions differently depending on the era in which you encounter it. Nixon had positioned them as representatives of a certain American wholesomeness, the antidote to the counterculture, the proof that young people could be talented and successful and not be a problem. Karen and Richard shook hands with the president and were photographed smiling. Karen later said she found the whole thing somewhat surreal. The touring schedule that accompanied all of this success was, by any reasonable measure, punishing. The Carpenters toured constantly through the early and mid-70s, not casually, but in the full industrial sense of the word, with the kind of schedule that was designed around maximizing revenue, and that did not build in meaningful rest. 200-plus dates in a year was not unusual. Karen was performing almost every night, often with a head cold or fatigue that she didn't mention publicly, because there was no framework in which mentioning it would have changed anything. She was also, during these years, cooking for the crew. This is a small detail, but it's a strange one. Karen had a genuine love of cooking. She was apparently quite good at it, and on tour, she would sometimes prepare food for the band and crew herself, which was not something that lead vocalists on that level typically did. It was practical and warm and also slightly odd. This woman who had just sung to 10,000 people, spending the post-show hours making sure everyone was fed. There's something in it about how she understood her role relative to other people, but it would be too easy to make it mean too much. By 1975, the Carpenters were worth something in the range of $20 million. Karen was 25 years old. She was also, by this point, smaller than she had been, noticeably. The weight loss had been gradual enough that it moved through the public eye without triggering alarm. There were diet jokes, compliments, the general background noise of a culture that responded to women getting thinner with approval first and questions much, much later. The people closest to her noticed. Some of them said something. Most of them didn't know what to say, or concluded that saying it wasn't their place, or decided that Karen was a grown woman who could manage her own health, or were simply too enmeshed in the operation of the machine to stop and examine what the machine was doing to its most essential component. The machine kept running. The records kept selling. The touring continued. And Karen kept getting smaller, very quietly, while 20 million people listened to her voice and thought she sounded like everything was fine. There is a photograph from 1975 that circulated in the music press and that most people, at the time, received as evidence that Karen Carpenter was looking good. She was thin. She was smiling. She was wearing something that showed her arms, which were, if you look at the photograph now, with different eyes, not the arms of someone who is well. But in 1975, thin was the destination. Thin was the point. The photograph ran and nobody wrote anything alarming about it. This is one of the central facts of Karen's story, and it is also one of the most difficult to sit with. She was dying in public, slowly, for the better part of a decade, and the mechanisms that should have registered alarm were instead registering approval. Anorexia nervosa was not unknown as a medical concept in the mid-1970s. It had been clinically described since the 19th century. But culturally, in terms of public awareness, in terms of what ordinary people and even most doctors understood about it, it was nearly invisible. There was no vocabulary for it in mainstream conversation. There was no framework that would have allowed someone watching Karen Carpenter on a television special in 1976 to think, that woman has a serious psychiatric illness and she is going to die from it. The framework didn't exist. What existed instead was the language of dieting, of discipline, of a woman who had gotten control of herself. Karen began restricting her eating sometime around 1973, though the precise origin point is contested in the way that the origins of eating disorders usually are, which is to say, there probably wasn't a single origin point. There was a review, somewhere in the early touring years, that described her as chubby. There was a culture, everywhere and always, that communicated with great consistency what women in the public eye were supposed to look like. There was a family dynamic in which Agnes Carpenter's approval was a resource that felt, to Karen, perpetually just out of reach. There was the particular pressure of being looked at by millions of people, nightly, while also being told, in subtle and unsubtle ways, that the looking was part of the job. She started using laxatives, then thyroid medication obtained without a prescription, then later, ipecac syrup, a substance intended to induce vomiting in poisoning cases, and one that, used repeatedly, destroys cardiac muscle. She weighed herself compulsively. She kept private records. She controlled what she ate with an exactness that, in another context, might have been called impressive. The people around her were not oblivious. Her brother noticed. Her mother noticed. Herb Alpert noticed. Various musicians and crew members on tour noticed. What happened with that noticing is the harder question. Richard raised it with her, more than once. Karen's response, and this is documented in multiple accounts from people who were present for versions of these conversations, was to deflect, to minimize, to turn it back around into reassurance. She was fine. She was watching what she ate. She felt great. She'd been to a doctor. The conversations would end because there was nowhere for them to go, because in 1974 and 1975, there was no treatment protocol to point someone toward, no specialist to call, no established understanding of what you actually did when someone you loved was doing what Karen was doing. What you did, mostly, was worry and continue. The touring continued, the recording continued. The machine Richard had built was generating too much revenue and carrying too much momentum to stop because one of its principals was unwell, especially when that principal was insisting, consistently, that she was not unwell. Karen showed up, she sang. Whatever was happening to her body was happening off stage, in private, in the space between performances where nobody had cameras. In 1975, Richard Carpenter collapsed. This part of the story tends to get a brief mention in most Karen Carpenter narratives before the focus returns to her, but it deserves more than that. Richard had developed a serious dependency on Quaalude sedatives, the result of years of insomnia exacerbated by the relentless touring schedule. By late 1975, he was not functional. He checked himself into a treatment facility. The Carpenters canceled a year's worth of engagements, a decision that cost them significantly and that was explained to the public in vague terms about exhaustion. Here is what's strange about this moment. Richard got help. Richard's problem was identified, addressed, and treated. He went somewhere, he worked on it, he came back. The infrastructure for that response existed. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but it existed. Addiction to sedatives was understood. There were doctors. There was a treatment model. Karen's problem continued without equivalent intervention. She was there when Richard went away. She managed things. She did interviews. She was, as she always was, competent and present and apparently fine. She was 80 pounds. The number varies slightly depending on the source, but it was somewhere in that territory at her lowest points. She was 5'4". The mathematics of it are not complicated, and they are not comfortable to state, but they are part of what happened. Karen Carpenter, at the height of her fame, weighed roughly the same as a child. Audiences didn't fully see it because the clothes were carefully chosen and the lighting was carefully managed, and Karen herself had become expert at projecting wellness she didn't have. But there were performances, some of which exist on tape, where you can see it if you know to look. The tendons in her neck, the way her hands look on the microphone, the quality of effort in her face that shouldn't be there in someone who is technically just standing and singing. She was working very hard to appear to be doing something effortlessly. There were interventions of a kind. Her management expressed concern. At some point around 1978, Agnes and Harold were apparently spoken to directly by people in Karen's professional circle. A doctor was consulted. Karen was told, in varying degrees of directness, that she needed to gain weight. What she heard, it seems, was something slightly different. She heard that she was a problem to be managed, that her body was, once again, a professional concern before it was a personal one, that the machine needed her to be a certain way, and right now she was not being it correctly. She had heard versions of this before, about her weight when she was younger and heavier, about the drums, about the disco record, about approximately where she should stand and what she should wear and how she should smile. She had become very good at hearing these things and nodding and then going back to her room and doing exactly what she'd been doing. In 1978, she gave an interview to a journalist who asked her directly if she had a problem with food. She laughed. She said she'd had some health issues, but that she was doing much better. She said she was eating well. She seemed, in the transcript of the interview, completely at ease. The journalist published the piece. It didn't set off any alarms. The silence around what was actually happening was not the silence of nobody caring. It was the silence of a culture that didn't have the language, of a family that didn't have the tools, of an industry that had too much invested in the continuation of normal, and of a woman who had learned, over the course of her entire life, that the way to be loved was to be manageable. She was managing. The exact dates are not perfectly documented, which is fitting, because what happened that week was itself a kind of undocumented thing, a brief, strange window in which Karen Carpenter tried to become someone slightly different, and then, fairly quickly, was redirected back to being who she was supposed to be. It was sometime in late 1975 during the pause created by Richard's collapse and treatment. The tour was canceled. The recording schedule was suspended. For the first time in roughly 5 years, there was no immediate professional obligation bearing down on Karen with the full weight of the machine behind it. She went to Las Vegas, not to perform, to think. She was spending time with a small group of friends, people outside the immediate Carpenter's apparatus, and in that context, away from Richard, away from Agnes, away from A&M, she started talking about what she actually wanted to do. What she wanted, apparently, was to perform as a solo artist. This is not a secret, exactly. It's mentioned in most biographies, but it tends to get treated as a footnote, a brief detour, before the narrative returns to the Carpenters and their reunion and the albums that followed. What gets less attention is how specific her vision was. She wasn't talking about a vague solo project as a side interest. She was talking about a different kind of performance. Looser, more contemporary, more her. She wanted to front a band that felt less like a precision instrument and more like a room full of people playing together. She had ideas about material. She had a sense of herself as a performer that the Carpenters' format had never quite accommodated. She also, notably, talked about getting back behind a drum kit. The people she was with that week described her as animated in a way they didn't always see. Not performatively upbeat. Karen had a version of that, the professional cheerfulness that showed up in interviews, but genuinely energized. She was making plans. She was making phone calls. She was, in the language people use when they describe someone who has briefly escaped a gravitational field, lighter. Then she went home. The details of what happened when she returned to the family orbit are not fully available, because the conversations that mattered happened in private, and the people who were present have given accounts that vary in their specifics. What's clear is the outcome. The solo project didn't happen. Not then. Richard recovered, and the Carpenters reconvened, and the next album, A Kind of Hush, released in 1976, came out and sold reasonably well and was reviewed with the same dismissive affection that critics had been extending to the Carpenters for years. Karen is on the cover looking composed. What she wanted is a subject she returned to in interviews throughout the late 70s, always carefully, always with the appropriate framing of love for her brother and commitment to the group. She would say something like, "I'd love to try something different someday." And then she would say something that brought it back around to the Carpenters, because she understood, by then, how these conversations were supposed to go. The solo album did eventually happen, not in 1975, but in 1979 and 1980, when Karen went to New York and worked with producer Phil Ramone on a record that was, by most accounts from people who heard it, genuinely good. Different. Adult contemporary, with an edge she'd never been allowed in the Carpenters' context. More personal. Some tracks that touched on loneliness and longing with a directness that her usual material carefully avoided. Richard didn't like it. This is documented. He heard the finished album and his response was, in professional terms, negative. He felt it wasn't right for her, that it didn't suit her voice in the way he understood her voice, that it was a mistake. There may have been other concerns. The album's commercial viability, the impact on the Carpenters' brand, but what got said, at least in the accounts that exist, was about artistic judgment. Agnes didn't like it either. A&M shelved it. The album, 18 tracks, a full completed record, was not released. Karen was told it would come out eventually, at the right time. It did not come out in her lifetime. It was released posthumously in 1996, 13 years after she died, to an audience that listened to it and heard, fairly clearly, a woman who had been told she wasn't quite right and who had turned out to be wrong about being wrong. The reviews in 1996 were good. Karen went back to the Carpenters. She and Richard made Made in America in 1981, their first studio album in years, and she promoted it and toured for it and gave interviews in which she spoke warmly about the collaboration and about how much she loved making music with her brother. She probably meant it. It's possible to mean something and to also be aware, in the background, that you are once again doing the thing you have always done and not the thing you wanted to do. There's an interview from around this period, 1981, a television appearance, where the host asks Karen what she would do if she weren't a singer. It's a throwaway question, the kind that gets asked to fill time. She says, I'd probably play drums. She says it lightly. She smiles. The host laughs. The conversation moves on. Karen Carpenter was 30 years old when she met Tom Burris, and by most accounts, she fell for him quickly and with a completeness that surprised even people who knew her well. This was 1980. She was in a period that felt, on the surface, like forward motion. The solo album was done, there was talk of a Carpenter's comeback, she had her own apartment in Century City, and some version of an independent life that she hadn't always had. She was, friends said, ready. Tom Burris was 41. He was a real estate developer, which in Southern California in 1980 meant he existed in a world of easy confidence and expensive cars and the particular social fluency of men who have learned to make other people feel like the most important person in the room. He was handsome, he was attentive, he pursued Karen with consistency and with what appeared, from the outside, to be genuine feeling. She was not practiced at being pursued. This is worth saying plainly. Karen had spent most of her adult life being the one who showed up, who performed, who gave. Her romantic history before Tom was limited, a few relationships that hadn't gone anywhere, a dynamic with men that people close to her described as slightly one-sided in ways that weren't always in her favor. She wanted, very much, to be chosen. Tom Burris chose her with apparent enthusiasm, and she responded to that in the way that people respond when they've been waiting a long time for something. They were engaged within months. The wedding was set for August 31st, 1980. Sometime before the wedding, the accounts differ on exactly when, some say days before, some say closer to 2 weeks. Tom told Karen something he had not told her during the courtship. He had a vasectomy. He could not have children, and he did not want them, and he had not mentioned this during the months in which they had presumably discussed their future together. Karen wanted children. This was not a minor preference. People who knew her well described it as one of the things she talked about with genuine longing, not in the abstract way people mention wanting a family, but specifically, concretely. She wanted to be a mother. She had, by various accounts, thought about it in some detail. She went ahead with the wedding. Why she did this is a question that doesn't have a clean answer, and it probably shouldn't. She may have believed Tom would reconsider. She may have felt that canceling the wedding, at that point, was a humiliation she couldn't absorb. She may have loved him in a way that temporarily reorganized what she thought she needed. She may have been so accustomed to accepting situations that weren't quite what she'd wanted that this felt, in some awful way, like familiar ground. Agnes, for what it's worth, did not like Tom Burris. She said so, and Agnes was not a woman who kept that kind of opinion to herself. The wedding happened anyway. The marriage lasted approximately 14 months before Karen filed for separation. The details of what those 14 months looked like are mostly private, but the broad shape is not. Tom's business dealings turned out to be significantly less stable than they had appeared. There were financial problems. There was emotional distance of a kind that Karen described to friends in terms that suggested she felt more alone inside the marriage than she had before it. The man who had pursued her so deliberately seemed, once he had her, less interested in the project. She moved back into her parents' house in Downey during the separation. She was 31 years old, recently separated, professionally in a holding pattern, while the shelved solo album sat in a vault at A&M, and living again in the house she had grown up in the city she had grown up in, under the same roof as Agnes. It is difficult to know what to do with this information except to let it sit there. The Carpenter family dynamic has been written about extensively, and with varying degrees of fairness to everyone involved. Agnes Carpenter has been cast in many tellings as the villain. The cold, demanding mother, whose preference for Richard was so obvious, it calcified into something damaging. This is not entirely wrong, and it is not entirely right. Agnes was a woman of her generation, formed by specific ideas about achievement and presentation and what a family owed the world. She loved her children in the way she knew how to love, which was bound up with performance and with pride and with a standard of excellence that didn't always leave room for the ordinary comfort of being simply accepted. Karen, who had spent her life trying to earn what Richard seemed to receive more freely, had moved back into that atmosphere. During the marriage, she'd had some separation from it. Now it closed around her again. What Agnes made of Karen's illness, whether she understood it, whether she connected it to anything about their history together, is not something Agnes ever discussed publicly in terms that would tell you much. She was not, by temperament, a woman who examined those kinds of questions aloud. The divorce proceedings were ongoing in early 1983. Tom and Karen were still legally married when she died. There is a moment that Karen's friends have described from this period, late 1982, early 1983, when she seemed, despite everything, genuinely hopeful. She was talking about the future. She was talking about the possibility of adopting a child. She was talking about working with Richard on new material. She was also, crucially, talking about her health in a way that sounded different. Not the practiced deflection of earlier years, but something more earnest, more frightened, more like someone who had started to understand what was actually at stake. She had just completed a course of treatment in New York. She had gained weight. The people around her looked at her and thought, maybe. Tom Burris did not attend the funeral. He sent flowers. Karen flew back to Los Angeles in November 1982. She had spent the better part of a year in New York under the care of a therapist named Stephen Levincron, who had written a novel about anorexia called The Best Little Girl in the World, and who was, at the time, one of the few practitioners in the country who had built a clinical practice specifically around the disorder. Getting Karen to him had been the result of an intervention of sorts. Friends, her manager, eventually family, converging on her with enough collective force that she agreed to go. This was not nothing. Getting Karen to agree to anything she didn't want to do required considerable effort. Levincron's approach was intensive. He believed that anorexia was fundamentally about emotional deprivation, that the control exercised over food was a response to needs that hadn't been met, and that treatment required addressing those needs directly, which meant talking about things Karen had spent 30 years not talking about. By several accounts, she engaged with this seriously. She was not a passive patient. She asked questions. She worked. She also, while in New York, began seeing a physician who treated her with intravenous nutrition and who prescribed a course of treatment that produced visible results. She gained weight, not all the weight she needed, but enough that when she returned to Los Angeles, the people who saw her thought she looked better. Her mother thought she looked better. Richard thought she looked better. The consensus was cautious but real. She was recovering. What the people around her may not have fully understood, what the field itself was still working out in 1982, was that weight restoration and psychological recovery are not the same thing, and that the second one takes considerably longer than the first, and that someone can look improved while still being in serious danger. Karen's heart had been under sustained assault for years. The Ipecac she had used, possibly for as long as a decade, does cumulative damage that doesn't reverse when the behavior stops. Her cardiac muscle was not what it had been. She came home, and she tried to live normally. She made plans. She talked to Richard about recording. She talked to friends about the future in the specific way people talk about the future when they have recently been frightened and are trying to believe the frightening part is over. She was taking medication. She was seeing a doctor. She was doing, outwardly, the things that recovery looked like. On the evening of February 3rd, 1983, she had dinner with her parents. She seemed fine. She went to bed in her old room, in the house in Downey, in the room that had been hers since she was 13 years old and had carried her drumsticks to the dinner table and driven her mother quietly mad with the tapping. The next morning, February 4th, her mother heard a noise. Agnes found Karen on the floor of her walk-in closet. She called for help. Paramedics arrived and worked on her for a significant amount of time before transporting her to Downey Community Hospital, where she was pronounced dead at 9:51 in the morning. She was 32 years old. The cause of death was cardiac arrest, brought on by what the coroner described as the long-term effects of anorexia nervosa. It was one of the first times the phrase appeared in a major American news cycle. The New York Times ran an item. The wire services picked it up. Within days, the story had moved from the entertainment pages into something broader. A conversation, halting and confused, but genuine, about a condition that most of the public was encountering by name for the first time. Karen Carpenter's death did not single-handedly create public awareness of eating disorders, but it cracked something open. Researchers who worked in the field in the years following have said, with some consistency, that it changed what they were able to do, that suddenly there was a name in the culture, a face, and that this made it easier to get funding and easier to get patients to come forward and easier to have the conversation at all. She would have had complicated feelings about this, probably. The solo album came out in 1996. Levenkron, in interviews after her death, said that she had made real progress, that she had understood things about herself she hadn't understood before, that she had wanted to live. He also said, with the honesty of someone who had watched it happen and couldn't stop it, that they had run out of time. The divorce from Tom Burris was finalized posthumously. Richard kept making music. Agnes lived until 1996. Harold until 1988. The house in Downey was sold eventually and then demolished, which is the kind of thing that happens to houses. There is a drum kit in the museum now, not the original, or maybe it is, depending on which account you trust. It's part of various Carpenter's exhibitions that have appeared over the years, in Downey mostly, in the places that have made a modest industry of preserving what she left behind. People file past it. They take photographs. They move on to the voice, to the records, to the familiar story of what was lost. Most of them don't stop at the kit for very long. The voice is what endures, which is fitting, and also, if you've been paying attention, a little uncomfortable. The voice was the thing she was given. The drums were the thing she chose. And the story of her life, in some essential way, is the story of those two things and which one the world decided to keep. She was 32. She had a completed album sitting in a vault. She had divorce papers in process, and a therapist who thought she was making progress, and a mother down the hall, and plans, actual plans, for what came next. Whether she would have recovered, fully, sustainably, in the way the word recovery implies arrival rather than direction, is not something anyone can answer. The people who treated her believed it was possible. The people who loved her believed it was happening. The body had its own timeline, shaped by a decade of damage, and it didn't wait to find out. What she wanted in the end was ordinary. A child, a different kind of work, to be seen as more than the voice, to be occasionally the one doing the choosing. The drum kit sits behind its barrier. Nobody hits it.